We're going to start off by showing a 7-minute film that was commissioned by Arts Council, which kind of summarises the project, and then Catherine and I will spend 6 minutes each on fleshing it out, so we're going to be fairly concise. So I'll sit down for a moment.
The Quality Metrics project is a research project that's being undertaken by a group of arts and cultural organisations in Manchester. And what they're trying to do is to see if they can come up with a standard set of indicators of quality that makes sense across the arts and cultural landscape, and that those indicators might be measurable by themselves, by their peers, and critically by the public.
This is something that we heard about, first of all, in Australia. The Department for Culture in Western Australia was undertaking a complete review of the way in which it funded and assessed its arts and cultural programmes. They commissioned a UK-based consultant, John Nell, to develop a framework for measuring quality. We thought it was very exciting, potentially, so we put a case to the Arts Council to just look in theory at whether it might be applicable in the UK, and that's what we did as the first phase of the project. So a group of about 13 cultural organisations in Manchester came together to brainstorm in a series of workshops what we'd want to measure if we wanted to measure the quality of arts and cultural productions. At the end of it, we'd come up with these dimensions of quality and a series of questions with which to address them. What we did next, of course, was that we needed to try and test these questions and the dimensions of quality out in practice. Would they actually work in a real-life situation? We've essentially used tablet computers as a way of delivering the questionnaire, and you indicate your level of agreement or disagreement to a particular statement. So it's very easy to do. What we've had to do, we realise, is train people to administer the questionnaire, to try and recruit people as they come out of the theatre or as they visit a museum exhibition. So we implemented our sort of theoretical framework of questions in 8 different arts and cultural productions, ranging from gallery exhibitions, museum permanent galleries, theatrical productions, classical music performances.
To carry out the peer assessment, each of the 8 organisations taking part in the pilots invited a small number of peers to come and see their show or exhibition and provide a review. And we asked peers to complete both a before and after survey. So they complete a survey beforehand explaining what they think the quality of the work is going to be like, and they complete a survey afterwards saying what they thought the quality was like in reality. And that's quite interesting because it enables us to see the extent to which a work matched up to expectations.
It's been important from the outset that this is a project that's been led by the sector. We always felt that it was only ever likely to get real take-up if the sector themselves led it and defined what those quality metrics needed to be.
So far in the pilot, what we've found is that the questions do pretty much work. They need a little bit of refinement to make sure they're comprehensible to every type of audience member, from the youngest to the oldest. How does it work with people with disabilities? So people with visual impairments. Does it work for literature, for example? That's something we've still got to look at. One of the things we found actually was that people were very keen to talk about what they'd just seen. And actually part of the process for members of the public was actually being able to express their views.
I liked how varied you could make your opinion, and the questions were fairly specific, so you knew what your thoughts would be.
Rather than filling out form and ticking and all that kind of stuff and filling out your name and stuff, it's very easy to just go yes, 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 done, there you go, thank you.
You're more willing to do it, and it seems so much swifter than going away with a bit of paper and then obviously you get the result there and then, as opposed to relying on us to hand it back to you.
In the future, there's possibilities for linking to social media, to Twitter and Facebook and other ways in which we can encourage people to sort of express their opinions about what they've just experienced. The great advantage of this scheme is that it would, in theory, allow all arts organisations and cultural organisations to adopt the same scheme and to produce for themselves longitudinal data on their performance over several years, but also for funding bodies to look right across the whole arts and cultural spectrum.
Well, the exciting news is that the group in Manchester has been successful in a funding bid to the Arts Council, AHRC, Nesta Digital Research and Development funding. It will allow them to undertake a further 12 months research. They'll have an opportunity to work with more arts and cultural organisations around the country and to bring more events into the testing so that Each organisation will have an opportunity to test 3 different events over a longer period.
We've just published a detailed report on the pilot, and the report is in 3 main sections. In the first section, we look at the headline findings for each event in turn, and we look at the peer before and after ratings and compare the responses from self, peer and public. In the second main section, we look at each of the quality metrics in turn, and for each metric, we compare the scores across the 8 events. And that gives us an opportunity to reflect on which metrics are working really well and which metrics are providing the most useful data. And then, because this was very much a pilot, there's a section in the report where we reflect on the process and we look at what worked well, what was more difficult, and things we would do differently next time.
What's encouraging is all the arts and cultural organisations that were involved recognise the results of the testing. In other words, they can see their own work in what their peers and what the public is saying. So that gives us some comfort that it's going to be worth taking this work to the next stage.
Having completed the pilot, we also think that while the tool is mainly a quantitative tool, we think it would be really helpful to include some space for reviewers to give some qualitative feedback. So for audience members, that would be an opportunity to describe their feelings about a work. So were they excited, amazed, captivated, bored, shocked? For peer assessors, it would be very helpful to have some free text space where they could provide some interpretive context to explain the scores that they've given in different areas.
We hope the quality metrics work will prompt a sector-wide debate about what we mean by excellence and will help us to understand the value of our investment in arts and culture across the country.
Okay, so that covered quite a lot of ground in 7 minutes for a project that's been going on for just slightly over 12 months. So in the 6 minutes I've got, I'm going to just put, as I said, a little bit more flesh on that in terms of the process and give a little bit of detail on the actual content of the metrics that we developed. But just to go back to the beginning, why do this? I think it was prompted by a feeling that despite all of the work on value and so on, the arts and cultural sector still struggles really to give an account of quality or excellence in a way that doesn't seem self-serving. You know, of course, everything that we do is good because we do it and we're members of the arts and cultural sector. And therefore, in a way that has credibility with external stakeholders, funders, government, and so on. So the aim, inspired by the Australian example, the aim of the Manchester pilot was really to see whether we could grasp the opportunity of a sector-led and sector-owned, bottom-up development of whether, really a research project, which is still ongoing, because we're not sure of the answer yet, as to whether it was possible to agree a pragmatic method of accounting for quality in a way that we were comfortable with and had credibility beyond our sector. So John Nell, we never really looked at the Australian work. John Nell took us through the same, as our consultants, through the same workshop format as he had developed in Australia, amongst the 13 cultural organisations in Manchester, crucially all represented by their directors or chief executives. So there was very high-level buy-in because I think a lot of people were very interested in the potential of this. Quite a few of them, I think it would be fair to say, were initially very sceptical. Of course, there'd be no way of gaining agreement across all of the different range of arts and cultural forms on a common set of metrics. But actually, the very process of doing it actually moved all of us to a situation whereby we felt there was something in common that could characterize all sorts of different arts and cultural forms. And as you'll be seeing in a moment, I was very struck by actually how the factors that we came up with actually were fairly similar to those ones that our Australian colleagues had independently come up with, and the ones that came out more or less from the literature review that we've just heard from John and Alan. So we worked through a series of several workshops to think, okay, if we were wanting to be measured as arts and cultural organisations on quality, what kind of dimensions of quality would we want to be measured on? And we came up with 2 broad categories, and I'll give more detail on the next slide. Things to do with product experience, depth of engagement, quality of the creative process, paralleled by, we felt it was very important to have a series of organisational health metrics on the basis that it would be possible, at least in theory, to be fantastically high quality but only ever appeal to an elite audience, or fantastically high quality through a maverick artistic director who ran the organisation into the ground financially. So there needed to be a sort of common set of metrics around the organisation, around finance and demographics that we normally collect, but also things like the quality and consistency of cultural and artistic leadership and the quality of collaborations that the organisation was involved in. We then worked on how these would be operationalized. In other words, if we wanted to measure these things, how do we actually construct a method of measuring them? And we came up with 9 dimensions that were measured by self, peer, and public. And I'll say a little bit more about this, but the triangulation of 3 different points of view is absolutely crucial to the potential of this, this framework, I think. And 5 that were, so 9 that were measured by self, peer, and public, and 5 that were just measured by self and peer because they assumed a certain insider knowledge of the sector. So we gave them particular titles like rigour and distinctiveness, but they were measured by specific survey questions on the tablet computers that you saw in the film. So rigour was a statement about the extent to which you agreed as an audience member or a peer or yourself as an organisation that it was well thought through and put together, or in terms of relevance, it has something to say about the world in which we live, or in terms of enthusiasm, I'd want to come to something like this again. And in terms of the self and peer, the 5 here, it was an interesting idea or program as a concept based on my knowledge of the sector. The artists or curators really challenged themselves with this work, so the extent to which artistic risk was embraced both in the particular production and in the organisation was crucial. And then there was something about, again, requiring insider knowledge about the extent to which it compared with similar productions nationally and indeed on a global scale. So then we needed to think about how we'd actually assess these dimensions, and this has been really covered in the film already. This crucial triangulation, introducing, I suppose, for the first time, we've already have artistic assessment and we have peer reviews through newspapers, but at the same time adding in the immediate public reaction in a way that allowed us to compare across the 3 ranges of opinions is a crucial innovation, I think. As you've seen, the other factor is that it can be aggregated both to provide long-term longitudinal data for the individual organisation and aggregated at higher scales if necessary. So we've moved really from a paper survey to an aggregatable online web app, which has quite big implications for back-of-house functions and eventually for big data if it's going to be adopted at a much wider scale. I've talked about the self and peer. This is what you've already seen a glimpse of the app already. It is actually all being tested on in a sort of separate project, but using the same dimensions in Glasgow at the moment on the cultural programme relating to the Commonwealth Game. That's why it says Glasgow Test at the top, for those of you who've got sharp eyes. And it's simply a very easy to do Slido, which converts to a metric percentage scale. A bit more detail on the pilot. 8 events, ticketed and non-ticketed in Manchester and in Cumbria as well. We wanted to put in a rural venue as well. It was November, December last year, so there's a certain Christmassy tinge to some of these things. And in terms of quality metrics, one of the issues we had to deal with was the Panto test. Would our quality framework, stand up to Panto? Organisations themselves selected peers. We were quite interested in the kind of academic example of approaches to peer review, knowledgeable peers from within the same sector or within the same region, as well as Arts Council artistic assessors as a kind of control group. Crucially, peers were invited to evaluate both before and after seeing the show. So they put down their scores on these different metrics as to what they were expecting, and then reflected on that after they'd seen the show, which brought out some interesting contrasts. A crucial hurdle was actually recruiting and interviewing people to administer the surveys, particularly in the smaller organisations, and in terms of scaling up, making this a sustainable piece of measurement is a crucial question for the next stage. And we then analysed the results and produced a report that Catherine mentioned. So here's an example, and I'm sorry you can't see all of this. I'll just talk you through some of the sort of highlight results. On the darker, I've got to keep to this being recorded, so I can't put the darker brown is the peer review, peer opinions before that's in, and the lighter brown is after. So in terms of rigour, in other words, it was well thought through and put together, and global excellence, it's amongst the best of its type in the world. Peer reviewers actually had higher expectations before than were borne out after the performance. By contrast, in terms of distinctiveness, it was different from things I've experienced before, and local impact, it's important that it's happening here. They agreed that these were higher, having seen it, than their expectations beforehand. So there's something interesting in the contrast between before and after peer scores. Here's another example, just the final one before I hand over to Catherine. This is Contact Theatre, a theatre particularly focusing on work with young people, and this was their Christmas show done by their Young Actors Company. And it shows that what happens when you contrast self-peer and public views. It was a typical bit of work by, with, and for young people. The peer reviewers, start with peer review. Peer reviewers in brown were generally comparing with all the other work they'd seen, not just children and young people, and were sort of fairly middling in their assessment of the quality. The self was the professionals in Contact themselves, and they said, yes, it's good, but it's not our highest quality work. That's the grey ones. But the public, which is in other words the young people for whom this was done and sort of whom is involved, were really enthusiastic all the way through. So it's perhaps this point that was made earlier about things that are artistically perhaps not the highest quality, judged by peers and professionals, can have very high public impact and enjoyment. I'm now going to... That's just a very quick insight into where we got to on the pilot, and Catherine's going to quickly review some of the reflections that we had on doing the pilot and set up the next steps.
Okay, so it was very much a pilot project, and so we reflected quite a lot on the process and how it had been, and I thought it would be helpful to share some of our thoughts with you as points for discussion today, really. First of all, the process of co-producing metrics, I think, is quite important, and I feel worked quite well in this project. So I would say we had a very positive collaboration with the cultural organisations in Manchester. We worked very hard in small rooms for long periods of time, thinking about what they wanted to evaluate and what metrics were going to capture the essence of those outcomes. Very useful, not least for the interesting conversations that it sparks about quality, what it means in different contexts. The obvious point about that, though, is that these metrics that we're using here, they're not rooted in theory as such, okay? I mean, they're not blind to theory in that we'd read quite a lot of the literature in the field. We'd certainly read some, but by no means all of the material in Alan and John's very useful reports. But this is designed to be a very pragmatic approach, I would say, in that we wanted the data to be useful and we wanted it to be used. And our idea is, therefore, that you need to involve the people who are going to use the data in deciding what data is going to be collected in the first place. The self-peer public feedback process comparison, I think that is interesting and works well. There's lots of interesting comparisons you can make, lots of interesting analysis you can do with the data. I don't think we've got the self-assessment process quite right yet, because at the moment we ask self-assessors to review the work in the same way that we ask peer reviewers to review the work, so they tell us their own personal views on the quality of the production. And the organisations in Manchester thought it could be much more interesting for organisations to use the self-assessment process more to set out what it is that they're hoping to achieve with a particular work. So the scores that they would expect to see if the work is successful from their audiences and their peers. And in that way, what you'd be doing really is comparing the reception of a work with the original artistic intention, and the organisations in Manchester thought that would be quite valuable. We did have quite a lot of conversation about the merits of quantitative versus qualitative data. Clearly, this is designed as a quantitative tool, okay? So it has all of the strengths and limitations that come with quantitative data. It's by no means is it a replacement for, I guess, kind of narrative forms of peer assessment or the kinds of in-depth interviews or focus groups you might have with audience members in other contexts. Having said that, clearly there is a bit of space to build in some commentary into the process. And in fact, one of the peers who took part in the Manchester pilot did say to us afterwards, look, I can give you my scores for this event, but I don't feel my scores mean a great deal unless I can tell you about the interpretive context in which I'm making these judgments. So a simple way to take a step in that direction is to include some open text fields in the survey, and we're experimenting with that at the moment. And then a quick point, I guess, about the point that Alan raised about the viability of making comparisons across events. And I think if you'd asked me about this before this project, I'd have been quite sceptical about the value of doing that. Having been through this process, I'm a bit more positive about it, not because you expect experiences to be similar, but precisely because it's in the difference that all the interesting analysis lies. And actually, in making comparisons between events, you get to reveal something quite interesting about the unique characteristics of a particular experience. And having said that, I do think you have to be incredibly careful about the comparisons you choose to make. But certainly within one organisation, to be able to track the quality of your work in a reasonably consistent way over a period of time, to be able to see how different decisions you make about programming or about marketing have an impact on who your audience is and how they respond, that seems to me to be quite a valuable thing to do. Next steps very quickly, because I think we're running out of time, is just to say that the Manchester Consortium with the University of Manchester and Counting What Counts, which is the technology company that develops the system, they've been awarded a grant from the Digital and R&D Fund for the Arts, which is the Nesta Arts Council AHRC fund. And so there's a 12-month project just getting underway now, which is a much kind of larger and wider process of research and development. Partly about refining the metrics, so certainly seeing what we can do to improve the core set that we've got here that you would hope would be applicable across lots of different types of events, but also exploring the potential to develop some more art form specific questions, for example, or some metrics that can be used in very particular contexts, so work for and with children, young people, for example, or work in a participatory context. We're going to do a much wider range of testing, lots more art forms, lots more organisations, lots more different settings, and see how the method works in very different places and where it falls down. There are lots of ways in which you can automate parts of this system. I mean, I think one of the important features is it's designed to be fairly straightforward, fairly quick, fairly cost-effective for organisations to use. And by automating parts of the system and developing some new features in the reporting side of things, we might be able to develop something that organisations can largely run themselves without needing people like me kind of in the middle setting things up. We're quite reliant on interviewers at the moment, although in Glasgow we're experimenting with sort of post-event email surveys, which work fine, but we'd like to be able to cut the need for interviewers out, and so we're interested in seeing whether you can persuade audience members and visitors to kind of under their own steam download the app and give their feedback and what it would take to build a kind of a culture of doing that. And with the University of Manchester, we've got an academic inquiry running alongside where we're going to be testing the value of the approach and interrogating and critiquing some of the concepts underlying the work, notions of co-production, and the idea of big data and what that really means in a cultural setting.